This is the Grapple Right Show, episode 80, featuring director of Tales of Masked Man, Carlos Ávila.
Lucha Libre, Mexico's unique variation on professional wrestling, has become a distinct aspect of the country's complex cultural identity. This is an exploration of Lucha Libre and a look at three masked wrestlers whose lives and whose own identities were transformed by it.
You're opening up the most wild comic book, and the panels become the ring, the characters come to life, and sit back and enjoy.
Welcome to the Grapple Dry Show. I've got an awesome special guest this week. This man, just under 15 years ago, made the amazing documentary Tales of Masked Men, which took a really deep look into Lucha Libre and sort of Mexican identity. And it is an awesome thrill to get him on the show. So please welcome Carlos Ávila. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you so much, Brett. Thanks for your interest in the documentary. Thanks for reaching out. I look forward to talking to you.
No, I very much look forward to this as well, sir. So my first question, anyone who's been on the show for the first time, it always is the same question. Where did it all begin for you?
Trips to Mexico with my family. I would see the masks being sold in mercados or being sold, at street corner posts where people would just display these beautiful masks. So that started the curiosity. We had the great advantage here in Los Angeles that we had the Olympic Auditorium, which was a big destination for Mexican wrestlers. And so God bless my mother and my stepdad, and they had no problem with taking us there on Friday nights. They'd load up the station wagon with kids and they would take us to see Lucha Libre, see American wrestling, because we also had the great American superstars like Freddie Blassie and John Tolos and Rocky Johnson. So we got to see all those people wrestle alongside the great Mexican luchadores that would come up. We got to see, my boyhood hero was Mil Máscaras, and he was, just larger than life. We also got to see the great Rudo tag team, Black Gordman and Goliath. Other people like El Solitario, Psicodélico. They also came to wrestle in Los Angeles. Los Médicos de México, another tag team of Rudos. So it was really combination of my trips to Mexico and then my interest in it, and my parents sort of honoring that interest. Additionally, we had local stations in Los Angeles that would broadcast it. So there was a Spanish language television station called KMEX, and they would broadcast the events from the Olympic Auditorium. And so we got to see it that way. On the weekends, there was KCOP, which was another independent local station, and they would broadcast matches. Those were in studio. They weren't from the Olympic Auditorium. But we got a lot of exposure. If you were looking for it, you could find it. And I was looking for it. I was hungry for it. There was my brother, myself, my whole family were really interested and invested in the matches. And so it really fueled my imagination. Perhaps it's a little bit revisionist, but thinking back on that experience of seeing someone like Mil Máscaras, who was just this powerful, heroic Mexican man, you didn't see a lot of that on television in the U.S. We were always the criminals. We were always the downtrodden. And so to see Mil Máscaras come into an arena and command your attention was very significant to me. Again, I don't know if that's revisionist, but I know that it made an impact, even if it was in a more subliminal way when I was a kid. So, so I think the larger in life characters, the storylines, the great feuds that would happen, the scale of it, being at the Olympic Auditorium, we would sometimes sit in the cheap seats and you can just absorb the whole venue and how many people were invested in those matches. As a kid, 10-year-old kid, there was nothing cooler, there was nothing more impactful. So that's really the origins of my interest in it, and that fueled me later on when I was trying to make the film.
Excellent. So, where did the film come from then? Because obviously, you're talking about when you, in your younger days and watching the Lucha Libre and going to see it and on TV and sort of, trying to get as much of it as you can. Is this something that carried on as you grew up, or is it something you sort of rediscovered sort of as you got older?
I left it, so for about, I got interested in other things, music, film production, girls, you just get taken away from it. And so then I'd say maybe when I was in my 30s, I rediscovered it because once again, an independent wrestling circuit developed in Los Angeles, and they were getting a lot of media attention in the local independent newspapers. The LA Weekly, which was the tabloid free alternative newspaper, they did a few articles on Lucha Libre, and so it rekindled my interest in it. And so I went back. There was a couple of events that surprised me. Now, perhaps in his late 60s, Mil Máscaras had returned to Los Angeles
Yeah.
and he was going to wrestle. And so I go, I got to go. And so I went with a buddy and I go, it's still Mil Máscaras. It's the guy, that's my boyhood hero. Additionally, there was a wonderful promotion that for a while was bringing Mexican wrestlers into wrestle alongside local wrestlers, and they would also integrate burlesque into the events. It was called Lucha Vavoom. And it was a really nice promotion. They would do it at a fantastic venue in downtown Los Angeles called the Mayan Theater. And it was a really nice experience. It was they would have stand-up comedians. I think Tom Kinney, who does the voice of SpongeBob, would MC from time to time. And so it was really a nicely packaged presentation and show. And so, once again, Mil Mascaras was a part of that. And so, so to see how evergreen Lucha Libre was, it wasn't just something that was a fad in Mexico that would, fall by the wayside. It was something that was consistent, that was eternal, that would constantly renew itself. And so all those things, were feeding me, inspiring me. And I had the opportunity to present a documentary pitch to. I had a relationship with public television here in Los Angeles. I'm sorry, it's actually national. Um, there was a couple of entities that eventually got involved. Latino Public Broadcasting that does programming that underscores Latino culture.
Mhm.
There was additionally the independent television service that does kind of the hipper, cooler documentaries that are on PBS in the US. And so it took a long time. The documentary took a long time, and at one point I abandoned it. I had some initial funding from Latino Public Broadcasting. We shot in Mexico for 4 days, where I was able to shoot in Arena, Mexico. I was able to, really do some beautiful B-roll, gather some B-roll material. And initially, there's storylines that exist in the documentary, and one of the intended storylines, was the story of Fray Tormenta, who was the prototype for what became Nacho Libre.
Yeah.
And Mexican wrestler who also was a priest, and he raised money through his wrestling to fund an orphanage for kids. I went to the orphanage. I spent time with him. We shot him in a lucha libre mask, um, doing a Catholic mass. I interviewed him. It was like a 3-hour interview. And not to diss the good father, but ultimately we couldn't come to terms. And so I wasn't able to use any of that material. So I invested, a lot of time in that storyline, and it didn't pay off. So I scrambled a little bit, but I had all this great material. There was all this other wonderful stuff that we were able to shoot, and it seemed like the project wasn't moving forward. It was dormant for about 3 or 4 years. Finally, Latino Public Broadcasting reached out to me and they said, what are you going to do with this material? And I said, I need more money to be able to go back and to really fully realize it. They wanted me to do an even shorter version, like a 10-minute thing that they could put up on social media or on their website. And I said, I really want to do something longer. I want to do something that kind of explodes the kitschy aspects of it. I think at least seeing commercials, seeing the portrayals of Lucha Libre. There was also the animated series Mucha Lucha, which was on the Cartoon Network. And it was really kind of goofy stuff. And, the portrayals in commercials, selling burgers for Burger King, they made the wrestlers seem like, buffoons. And that wasn't my experience. I always flash back to Mil Máscaras and I see how elegant he was, how commanding, what a compelling presence he was. And I wanted to show that side of Lucha Libre. So Latino Public Broadcasting encouraged me to explore that a little bit more. They gave me more funding and I was able to go back and shoot. At that point, I'd been introduced to Solar, who's in the documentary. We got a nice showcase segment on Solar in the documentary. And then one thing that always impressed me when I would go see the wrestling at the Olympic Auditorium was the mini wrestlers, the little people wrestlers. And so somebody introduced me to Mascarita, and his story is so profound and beautiful and empowering that I felt that was a story that really needed to be fleshed out and to explore a little bit of the tradition of the little people in wrestling, not treating them as, for lack of a better word, circus freaks, but treating them as professionals. And so, Mascarita was a real gentleman. He was very generous. He let us shoot in his home. He was very kind to me and was very open with me in telling his story. So so that was the goal, right? Is to explode that kitschiness and say, look, these guys are professionals. They take it very seriously. Yeah, they're a lot of fun. Yeah, they can blow your mind by their athleticism and their ability to to be exceptional wrestlers in the ring, but they have this human side, they have this humanity, and that was part of the story that I was trying to tell, in addition to some of the cultural things that we'll talk about.
No, definitely. Because I think what you've done is you really sort of opened up. What I liked about it is you just opened up the whole essence, I guess, is the word. The whole essence of Lucha Libre. It wasn't just a wrestling match. It wasn't just it's a Mexican thing or it's a mask thing and they're superheroes. Or it's just that you put it all together. And I don't think that's really been done before. Like you say, we had. Everyone knows the Jack Black film, and when that came out, suddenly everyone became an expert in Lucha Libre for a week.
Right.
There's been in the UK, especially, there's not been that much stuff. We've had like exposure to it through the various wrestling promotions, WWE and whatever, that have been around in WCW. But before that, there was the odd documentary. I remember there's a television presenter in England called Jonathan Ross who used to do a TV show called The Incredibly Strange Film Club or something like that. And it would be one week it was like Bela Lugosi, one week this, and one week it was only like half an hour, 40 minutes, but he did one on Lucha Libre, and he had the whole Fray Tormento was on there, and a lot of it was El Santo and the El Santo movies and the Mexican thing like that. And again, that was probably on in the late 80s, and I haven't seen it since then, but I can remember most of it because it made an impact, because it was just like, wow, this is something you don't get, that like the El Santo thing, especially. I mean, we'll get into that, get a little bit more later on, but you don't get the way that the cold, there are fans and there are things behind things, but it was just something that really stood out to me. And I think that's what you've done in your film. You've got the lucha libre, you've got the Mexican identity, and you
Yeah.
kind of, I guess the documentary argues that, lucha libre is deeply connected to the Mexican culture. Can wrestling ever truly be separated from the culture there? What is it that binds them together? What is it that makes it such of a almost like a religious movement in some ways?
I in the documentary, I tried to explore that, and I do speak with a cultural anthropologist, and she does give me her perspective
Yeah.
in terms of, pre-Columbian, pre-Columbian Mexico and the fascination with deities, with how animals take on spiritual and cultural significance, the use of masks, so we explore that as well, the tradition of using masks and how that extends back into pre-Columbian times. There's just an ongoing fascination with those types of heroic figures and with warriors, and so there is a lineage between the luchador and the jaguar warrior and the tiger warrior and all those things that exist in pre-Columbian Mexico. So, it's perhaps speculation to say that there's a direct line, but I think that there was an acceptance of that way of thinking of heroic figures, and so it was embraced. To sort of articulate the passion for it, it's interesting because in the documentary we talk about Salvador Luteroth, who was the promoter who first started the big promotion in Mexico, and he actually had seen it in the United States. So he had seen a wrestling match in Texas, and he thought that there would be an appetite for it in Mexico City. So he brought some of the wrestlers from Texas, people that he had seen wrestle there. He brought them to Mexico City. They put on some matches. They used some local wrestlers as well. But there was just a fascination with it. The first masked wrestler to wrestle in Mexico was actually not a Mexican wrestler. It was the Masked Marvel, who would go around the United States and use the gimmick of, he was a masked man, and if you beat him, he would take off his mask. But that caught on so well in Mexico that suddenly there was an appearance of so many different wrestlers that were utilizing the mask. Um, boxing is a huge sport in Mexico. And so I'm sure that the parallels of that, it was a different type of combat, but I'm sure that the two fed into each other. If you were a fan of boxing, perhaps you would embrace lucha libre. Um, so it's hard to draw direct lines, but I think that there's relationships that feed into each other. And we talk about him in the documentary, but I think if you're open to that type of mysticism, if you're open to that type of combat experience, watching it, then you're going to be susceptible to getting the lucha libre bug.
I think one thing I think as well with Lucha Libre compared to other styles of wrestling around the world, it's got that kind of legacy thing. The mask, the character gets handed on. It's almost like, again, it's that almost what you were saying earlier. It's preserving those traditions that have gone on before them and long before that. But with Lucha Libre, the mask gets handed on, the character evolves and continues
Yeah.
down. Why do you think it is? Like in Mexico, Lucha Libre, that is such a big deal, but you don't see so much of that in other styles or other things, like especially like Japan, the United States, the UK. That's whilst there are, obviously there's like sons and daughters of wrestlers and things like that, that sort of mystique doesn't always get passed on with it. What is it about the lucha libre side of it that allows that thing to sort of carry on through generations?
I could be romantic and say that, there's, sort of that classic understanding of, you know, the need for a legacy, the keeping a tradition going. That is truly a part of it. I mean, I was able to talk to El Hijo del Santo a little bit, and he really did a beautiful job in embracing his father's legacy and kept it going. Um, I haven't seen his son wrestle yet, but I know that they're positioning
Yeah,
him to wrestle as well. Um, so I think there is, that part of it is real with some wrestlers. In some cases, it's a little bit more pragmatic, right? It's the family business. It's what they know. The
yeah,
brazos, brazo de plata, brazo de oro, that family, is a large lucha libre family. And it's what they know. That's where their connections are. That's where their understanding of a business that they know how to navigate. And so they pass it on. And, that know-how makes things a little bit easier for the ones within the family unit who are coming up. So that family business aspect of it, I think, is real. Um, you know, I don't know if I'm speaking too candidly, but in the case of Solar, the son who appears in the documentary as I think he's wrestling. They've had two different names, Hijo de Solar and then Solar Jr. I'm not sure which name Jovan was wrestling under, but he tried to take on the mask, and it was great to document him and to film him doing it. But he's no longer wrestling. There's another son who's taken on the 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 mask of Solar. And so he seems to have a little bit more natural affinity for it. So I think it's the passing on of a tradition, but it also has to be the right fit for the son.
yeah.
And so that's something that has to be um, searched out among the family members to see if somebody wants to do it and whether or not they have the natural affinity for it, and they have the athleticism and the commitment to it because it's a big commitment. That's your life. I think with Jovan, the young man who appears in the documentary, I think he had other interests. I know that he was going to college. I think he was studying psychology. So it wasn't a natural fit for him, but he tried. And so now this other son is doing it. So, there is that honorable romantic notion of passing on a legacy, but then I think it's also just the more practical aspect of it being a family business that they understand.
No, no, fair enough. And you talk about the mask in the passing on the mask though. So is it then? Is it we all know with Lucha Libre, there's value in the mask, there's mastery mask matches and that. I mean, what is it about the identity that makes it so important? Because if a wrestler loses this mask, that is like the biggest deal in Lucha Libre. And, why is it built up that way? Why does it, because, you cover about losing the mask in the documentary as well and the identity, but why is that such a big deal? What is it about it? Because, we see wrestlers all the time, they lose masks or there's a haircut, whatever, but in Lucha Libre, it's like it's such an important thing. Why?
Just one other point in
Oh
regard to
yeah,
your previous question. Mil Máscaras has never designated Mil Máscaras Jr. So it's interesting that, not everybody does that passing of the legacy thing. He has been very clear about only wanting to be the only one who wore the Mil Máscaras mask, or the thousands of Mil Máscaras masks. Um, so it's interesting that the various wrestlers have different takes on it. There's Blue Demon and then Blue Demon Jr. I'm sure that there's a son that's in the wings, preparing to wear that mask as well. The luchas de apuesta, right? The ones where they bet their mask against another wrestler. You know, I remember attending a few of them, and there was high drama associated with those matches. And losing a mask, again, there's the pragmatic side and then the romantic notion, right? So there is a certain aspect of shame in losing a mask. You've lost your position, you've revealed who you are. You no longer have the mystique of being a masked wrestler. So that is very true. That does happen. And yet again, we see that in the modern, more pragmatic world, that shifts. The classic example is Rey Mysterio, who lost his mask and then put it back on, continue to wrestle with a mask because that was his bread and butter. That was his calling card. But he did lose it in a match. Yeah, the person who I got to know just a little bit was Dr. Wagner, and he was the son of the famous Dr. Wagner.
Yeah.
They get to a point in their career where, and I don't mean to be crass, but it's at their peak popularity. Maybe they're aging, and so there is great value in cashing in, right? So to lose your mask is a financial decision as well, and so that happens. I know that in the case of certain wrestlers, that has been the motivation to lose your mask. Storylines are plotted out. I don't want to go too far into peeking behind the curtain, but storylines are worked out, and someone's going to lose their mask. So so it's both things. It's the honor of losing your mask, but then also they're human beings. They get older, and my great hero is besides Mil Máscaras is Solar, who I don't know his exact age, but if he's not in his late 60s and he's in his early 70s, and he continues to wrestle, and he continues to risk his mask from time to time, and he's never lost it. He has said he's never going to lose his mask, and so he's never been cornered into a position where he's had to bet his mask with the complete risk of losing it. So, I've been around it a little bit, and I've heard those conversations about what's involved in terms of deciding whether you're going to lose your mask or not. Sometimes there is a blood rivalry that just has gotten out of hand, and they don't care. It's all bets are off. They're going to risk it. But then there's also just the idea of, well, this is the peak moment for me to risk the mask.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Why do you think then, in like outside of Mexico? I mean, there have been some masked wrestlers through the years. I mean, the UK had Kendo Nagasaki. In the US, there's been Masked Superstar, and there's been different big name, the Destroyer, and things like that in Japan and America. But why do you think there's never been that much of sort of a cash in on the sort of the mask gimmick as such? Apart from there's been some, I know like some of the bigger promotions have done like short-term programs where someone or they've lost and come back under a mask and we're not supposed to know it's them, but we do, those sorts of things. But why do you think it is that like no one's ever sort of gone that far with it that much, apart from it being like another excuse for someone to sort of wrestle twice and get two paydays on like a house show or somewhere like that? It's sort of they've never really kind of, or I'm trying to think now. I'm sure that someone will comment, "Oh yeah, but there was that one," and there probably was, and I've forgotten one. But Mr. Wrestling as well, people like that. But there hasn't really been that kind of massive push of creating this identity. I mean, WWE done it with like obviously Rey Mysterio is the first one in recent memory when he got there to say the mask went back on and they went all in on it. But they've never sort of tried to get one or try to get it to go. They've got people in now and then, and but it's always been short term. Why does it not work? Does it fail, or is it just something they're not that invested? Why does it? In Mexico, boom, there you go. It's big time. In other places, it's tried and not. Why do you think that is?
You know, um, great question. I think my initial impulse in answering that question is, um, I think perhaps it diminishes your marketability in terms of, um, your identity and your face are a calling card. There's something that you can sell. There's not the strong tradition in the United States. I'm speaking specifically about the United States,
Yeah,
in terms of, um, in terms of using the mask. It's just not something that, there's been a little bit. I guess the Destroyer was one of the famous
mm,
mass wrestlers here in the US, but it hasn't really quite caught on. I mean, Mexico, um, there's just such a strong tradition of using the mask. It's so accepted. We haven't even talked about the film culture that surrounds the luchador, which is a whole other thing. So there is more of a mystique to the mask in Mexico. I'm thinking that, the United States is just hasn't quite caught on in the same way. But the films, and there is some celebrity and there is some visibility and there is some great mystique in wearing a mask in Mexico that just is really very much a part of the culture and it's more accepted.
no, definitely, definitely. Well, you kind of brought on to my next bit, really. I was going to talk about. I mean, in the documentary, you got to chat to El Hijo del Santo. His father, Al Santo, was sort of was the I think the first sort of big star that sort of transcended Lucha Libre. Like you say, he had like 50, I can't remember, 52 or 54 movies, let alone cameos and adverts and whatever else he popped up in. How, why does that happen? Because, we have wrestlers nowadays. I mean, Hulk Hogan for years tried to conquer Hollywood. The Rock did it a little bit after his wrestling. But Hulk Hogan at the time was probably the biggest wrestler on the planet in the sort of the late 80s, early 90s, but it didn't quite. He never topped Rocky 3. He never kind of got any bigger than that. But like Al Santo was just like almost a license to print money at some point. There were films coming out where he was just doing all this stuff. Why did it? And then obviously Mil Máscaras had films. Blue Demon was in a load, and
Sure.
and it's just sort of carried on from there. Why is that? What can't people get enough of?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't continue, right? I mean, we don't see a lot of luchador films happening, but you know,
Yeah,
at the time, it was like the cowboy film, it was like the gangster film.
yeah,
It was just a very defined genre that there was an appetite for. I mean, we've seen the films, right? So we know that they were B movies, that they were made
yeah,
inexpensively. They didn't cost a lot of money to produce. And so, if you have a brand, if you have an icon like El Santo or Mil or Blue Demon Jr. or Blue Demon, then that's a marketable item that you can include in a film. They caught on, they were very, very popular for a stretch of time, but they were fantasy films. I think they were making them into the 70s. I know that there was maybe one that was made in the 90s. I think that Mil Máscaras made one. It was actually an American production in the 2000s. Mil Máscaras versus the Aztec Mummy. which I was able to see, and I got to know the filmmakers a little bit because that was at the time that I
Yeah.
was researching the documentary. But sadly, I mean, it's not a genre that has continued on any grand scale. There's just those niche films that come out occasionally. Certainly, for all its buffoonery, Nacho Libre was fantastic, because
Mm.
it did introduce on a large scale the masked wrestler, and it was really beautiful to see the love that Jack Black showed towards that tradition of filmmaking. Of course, Jared Hess, the filmmaker, was also they were very loving in their approach to the subject matter.
Yeah.
But it was a genre of film that had its moment, and it has petered out, I think to a large extent. I know that I do hear the occasional project that is in either development or production. Here in the United States, about 4 years ago, Disney had a series. I'm probably mistaken, but I think it was called Black Scorpion, and it was they did, they had grand aspirations for it, but it didn't quite take off. I think they did 10
Oh
episodes.
yeah, was it the one that was like and his daughter, wasn't it, or
Yeah,
something like
it was
that?
his
Yeah, I
his
know the one you
niece,
mean. Yeah,
his
his
niece,
niece. That was it.
his
Yeah,
niece. That's right. So there's always attempts, and someone's going to get it right. It's like Pirates of the Caribbean finally got the pirate movie right. After
yeah,
many attempts, and someone's going to get it right. But it hasn't happened yet. So maybe it'll come back, and it'll be something that spawns numerous sequels. I'm surprised there hasn't been a
yeah,
Nacho Libre 2.
yeah. Do you think then? Do we need another Al Santo type to sort of bring that through? Because I mean, I don't think people nowadays, when people say he was popular, I don't think people get how popular he was. I mean, we talked before, like in the UK, you had Big Daddy. In Japan, you had Ricky Dozan, you had Antonio Inoki. But Al Santo in America, obviously Hulk Hogan. But Al Santo was like probably all of them combined in popularity. It was
Yeah.
he was a big deal. What was can you just sort of just for anyone who hasn't seen about I know you go into it, but just talk a little bit about the sort of the mythology of Al Santo, I guess, and just how big he really truly was.
Well, I applaud your show because you have done some really beautiful segments on El Santo, and
Mm.
I think the fact that he's so iconic and persists I'll send you one of my pictures with Hijo del Santo, but
Yes.
but he and I'm sure I'm going to get flack for this from my family, but the luchador and in particular El Santo are as ubiquitous and as iconic and as present in representing Mexico as something like the Virgen de Guadalupe, which is the Madonna, right? That's
Mhm.
those types of images, the sombrero, you think about sombrero, you think about Mexico, you think about the Virgen de Guadalupe, you think of Mexico. You think about El Santo, you think of Mexico. And so it's everywhere. I mean, here in Los Angeles, you'll see El Santo masks everywhere still. So I mean, he has a beautiful story, right? He had wrestled for a while with varying degrees of success. He met up with a promoter and they came up with this gimmick of him wearing a mask. And originally he was a bad guy, right? He was a rudo.
Mm.
But that quickly turned and he became a a technical. He became a good guy wrestler. And then I think, certainly from the conversations that I had with Lourdes Grobet, who was a photographer, wonderful Mexican photographer who documented the scene in the 70s and 80s. She got to know him. And the one thing that she observed from him specifically, certainly there was the fame that was associated with his movie appearances, just that his image was everywhere as a result of the films. But the way that he carried himself, his interactions with the fans, um, the other beautiful stories that I heard about him was, there's a gentleman who is in the documentary, Christian Simet, and he told some great stories about El Santo. And there's one that was very moving, where a promoter has a promotion. He invites all these wrestlers to wrestle, including El Santo, who is the headliner. They get to the event. The promoter didn't sell enough tickets. Santo has a guarantee of, 5,000 pesos or whatever it was at the time.
Yeah.
And Santo sees the predicament that the promoter is in. He doesn't have the money to pay the other wrestlers. And so he says, here, take my guarantee and pay the other wrestlers. And, so there was a generosity of spirit that became legendary. Louis de Scrobet and her photographs, you can see it. You can see the way that he interacts with just regular folks, regular people, and that demeanor, that willingness to sort of extend himself and go above and beyond, in terms of how he interacted with fans and with people. I think that really took root in people's consciousness. And he lived up to the name, right? El Santo. He lived up to the name of being the saint. There's an emotional aspect to it. There's also the cultural aspect because he was so omnipresent. And that persists. I mean, you go into people's homes, you see a picture of El Santo. So it's very enduring. And additionally, as I mentioned earlier, El Hijo de Santo has done a really beautiful job of keeping that alive.
Yeah, he wrestled recently on his retirement tour in London, but I couldn't go. It was a weeknight, and
Oh yeah.
I'm a school teacher by day, and I
Is
think
that
that was my
right?
last
Fantastic.
chance to see him.
That's
So I couldn't go. But
I,
oh
I
well,
would
it
send
is
you
what it is.
messages. I would send you messages and I go, oh, you know what? I shouldn't have sent it at 3 in the afternoon here in Los Angeles because I'm sure I was waking you up. So I was
Oh,
concerned
don't worry
about that
about
after
that.
a while.
Oh, don't worry about that. I'll be right. I'll be right. But so do you think then will there ever be someone like Al Santo again? Someone that just pulled it all together? And like you say, it wasn't just a thing of being in the right place at the right time. In
Yeah.
the documentary I was on about years ago that I watched, and it's just popped into my head now. I remember they were talking to, I forget the gentleman's name, but he was put across as like Al Santo's manager. And he
Hmm.
said, and he was talking about the characters of Lucha Libre, and he said something like, to create something is easy, but to maintain it, that's the challenge, or something like that. It was, so I'm paraphrasing it slightly, but he said, and he more than maintained it, and he did
Yeah.
it, and that's how he transcended, and that's always stuck in my head, like however many years later this is now from when I watched that. It was the 80s, but yeah, and it's that sort of thing. Do you think there will ever be something like that again? I mean, even going, not to dwell on it, but like,
Yeah.
his funeral was like a national day of mourning. How many sports people
Absolutely.
nowadays? There are
Yeah.
tragedies that happen, and we're sad about them, but like
Sure.
the scope of it was, like it was a massive deal, and I don't think people get that sometimes. Yeah,
It's again, there is I tend to be pragmatic about these things. There is I like yourself was very moved by those photographs that I saw of El Santo's funeral, where there's his casket is just surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people. So there was great affection for it, and it was being expressed in such a visual way, such a visceral way. Um, Whether that could be repeated, I don't know. I mean, there have been some stars that have come on the scene, like Rey Mysterio. I happened to see, because when we started shooting the film, uh, I got to see Místico wrestle, and my God, he blew my mind just how acrobatic he was, how unique and special he was. Um, but there's the business side, right? So he leaves, he goes to WWE, becomes
yeah,
Sin Cara. So I think it's very difficult now because there's certainly the obligations and the needs of the different wrestling promotions, CMLL, Triple A. There's a few others, smaller independent wrestling promotions. And so in many cases, the wrestlers themselves don't control the gimmick, right? They don't control
Yeah.
the mask. And so, that has been the issue with Mascarita Sagrada, right? So Mascarita was invited to wear the mask. And so he wore it and he established the mask. But then that time came to an end and they brought in another Mascarita. So it's whether an individual person can embody the mask. I think there's too many obligations to promotions that make it more complicated than it might have been when El Santo wrestled.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit more complicated now. I haven't seen anybody sort of capture the imagination. They come and they go, right? I'm reaching for a name. I'm gonna forget it, but it was he was Dos Caras Jr. He was Mil Máscaras' nephew, and he came.
Oh, Alberto Del Rio.
Yeah, Alberto Del Rio,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so he wrestled with the mask. He got an opportunity in WWE to wrestle as Alberto Del Rio. And then, he had a career in the US, but then that came to an end. And then, he took the gimmick back to Mexico, but I don't think that he's quite risen to that level of popularity that I think you're talking about. So it's very, very hard because there's too many other forces involved.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Like I said, Rey Mysterio and Místico were the guys that I was thinking might be able to achieve it, but to see their business moves, their financial needs, sort of outweighed that need for legacy. I think that Rey Mysterio is a very significant, heroic, impactful image, a character and wrestler, but I don't know that he's El Santo level.
Yeah. I'm wondering if his son Dominic might get there eventually because he's
Is he,
totally he's totally pure evil at the moment, but he's in
is
that
that
thing
right?
of like it, but he's becoming very cool with it, if you know what I mean. So I think
Right,
when
right.
if they do it right and turn him at the right point, I think
Yeah,
they might catch lightning in a bottle type thing. But
very
we'll
good.
see what happens.
Is he wrestling for WWE?
Yeah, he's in
Is
WWE
he?
and he's the AAA mega champion as well because
Is that right?
WWE where they've got that now, they're sort of people are going all over the place sort of thing. Yeah, so he's doing very well, but he is like he's very much kind of well, he's disowned in the storyline. He's disowned Ray, and he wishes Eddie was his dad, and all that sort of thing. And it's sort of, so they've almost called back to what they did when he was a little
Right,
kid, like, and
right.
it's sort of, and it's kind of they've done it well. But I think if they do
Uh-huh.
it at the right point, he's going to be sort of Steve Austin level, like because he's
Right,
almost
right.
he's getting so evil that he's becoming cool, kind of thing, and it's. And in a minute they can do it, but it's worth a watch. It's worth a watch.
I will look him up.
He's
That's
doing well. He's
fantastic.
doing well. And but
No
yeah, you said
mask
about
though, right? He's not
no,
wrestling
no,
with a
no,
mask.
no.
Right? Okay.
He wears his grandfather's. He wears a Rey Mysterio original mask.
Okay.
Was it his grandfather? No, his
It
uncle.
was his
No,
uncle.
uncle.
His,
Yeah, but then
his
he
uncle.
takes it off. He wears it like to the ring and takes it off. And he's
Okay.
got it
All right.
tattooed on. He's got it tattooed on his neck as well now. So
Okay. Wow.
he's keeping it going in his own way, I guess.
Okay.
But
Fantastic.
what I was going to say, yes, you talk about all the different organisations and the promotions and that now, and maybe the ties to that. One of the things that really came across strong in your documentary was kind of the grassroots of the lucha libre style,
Yeah.
like these neighborhoods having different spaces and rings and sort of like mini arenas and stuff. What was that like going into that? Because obviously, Arena Mexico sold out, big crowds. You
Yeah.
expect some sort of atmosphere, but when you're just sort of on the street level going into it
Yeah.
all, I think you sort of, sort of the working class audience, if you will. What was that like seeing? Because that's like almost the true lucha libre as well, isn't it? You know, like you say, it's in the culture. You can
Yeah.
see it is. What was that? What was that like for you going in and sort of talking to people and doing that sort of side of it?
Well, we see a little bit of that here in the United States, with the independent promotions. Uh, Going into Mexico and being in some of the smaller venues, certainly there's Arena Mexico, which is incredible place, Arena Coliseo, another great legendary venue, some of the larger ones in Mexico. And it's beautiful to be in those spaces because you know their history. But I love the smaller venues too. We were able to shoot in a venue. It's also in Mexico City, but it's on the outskirts, Naucalpan. I believe that's the way it said, Naucalpan. And so we were able to shoot some of the Mascarita and Gulliver interviews there. And that was a smaller neighborhood venue. And even that was a little bit more established. We shot also in Tijuana I think it's called the Auditorio Municipal. That was also a slightly larger venue. But then you have these smaller neighborhood events. You go to a flea market, you go to a mercado, and it's a different experience, but it's very grassroots. It's very neighborhood in its orientation. I love going to see wrestling here in Los Angeles because there's also that aspect. You go to a swap meet, there could be a wrestling event. You go to the one of the promotions that I talked about earlier that started up in Los Angeles maybe about 20 years ago. There was a promoter named Rocky Roman who has since passed away, but he would do wrestling events in wedding reception halls here in LA. And I went to maybe three or four of those, and I was always very impressed. For $20, you could see a Mexican star as well as some wonderful local wrestlers. And those are neighborhood folks. Those were people, they weren't people who were going to pay the big bucks to go see a WWE event. They were people from the neighborhood who would just come and want to see that Mexican star or to relive that lucha libre experience that they might have had when they were kids. That was my affection for it. And so that's very real. You get it from just the smells and the food that's being served. You can, buy a churro, you can buy tacos, you can buy, um, you know, all those things that make it feel like home. And so that part of the experience I think is very attractive to people is reliving their childhood. And, I talk about in the documentary how it's passed on to the next generation. I've seen that many, many times. You see a very multi-generational experience at a lucha libre event. Older folks, younger people, kids, and so it's something that crosses generations, and it's very exciting to see that potentially it will continue because of that passing on of the tradition.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really comes across now, like you say, is that tradition, the multi-generational thing, and that sort of that sense of community that's there. Like you say, everyone sort of knows people. They've seen everyone grow up together over the generations. Do you think wrestling in general, and or lucha libre especially, is there a threat? Because there's this sort of a lot of wrestling now is very much online communities, and as soon as someone does something, everyone's on their keyboard going on about it. It doesn't seem to be as much in lucha libre, but do you think that's something that's growing now that might be sort of taking away from that sort of community space and that sort of atmosphere of that? Do you think it's becoming more like that, or do you think it's more kind of still, like in the sort of communities are still in the arenas rather than being online?
Yeah, I haven't checked attendance at arenas recently, but I think it's still, certainly strong enough, to still be reminiscent of, what it might have been, 30, 40 years ago. Um, I haven't ventured into the chat rooms or the online
Yeah.
exchanges. I don't really know that side of it. Um, but I think there will always be a version of it. I mean, I think it's just so ingrained in Mexican culture, in Mexican American culture. The other wonderful thing that I discovered, I wasn't able to get into it in the documentary, but is, certainly these luchadores, they travel, and many of them would wrestle in Latin America. So El Santo would go to Latin America and wrestle there. So a version of lucha libre exists in Latin America in different countries. Certainly the luchadores have come to your country,
Mm.
and that's been very exciting to be able to share it on that level. Um, and the documentaries do it. Yeah, so I think I answered your question.
No, no, good. I mean, I think that's the main bit, and that's what really comes across in the documentary as well. Lucha Libre cannot exist without the audience and the audience interaction.
Exactly.
That's sort of wrestling in general as well, but Lucha Libre especially. Those guys are fired up. What is it about the crowd participation in that just makes it so much more special? We talked about the wrestlers and what they bring. What does the crowd
Yeah.
bring that makes Lucha Libre different from your normal wrestling show?
I've not been to a WWE event, but I have been to, Lucha Libre events in small venues and large venues. And
Mm.
the crowd is spectacular. And it's something that I think one of our commentators talks about and that I've witnessed, firsthand many, many times
Yeah.
is how um, wonderfully comical and belligerent some of the crowd can be in terms of their interaction with the wrestlers. There's so many stories of members of the audience becoming stars in and of themselves just because of the strong presence that they have in the arena and the relationship that they have with the wrestlers. I don't see that in WWE events that I've seen on television.
Yeah.
There isn't, that sense of, okay, that member of the audience is a star. There's somebody who, people care about. There was when I would go to see the wrestling matches as a boy at the Olympic Auditorium in LA. There was a black woman who would wear a cowboy hat and she would always sit in the front row and she would get into it with the wrestlers, be it the Mexican luchadores or be it with the American wrestlers. And those types of personalities are part of the experience and one of the reasons why you want to go. You want to see what that person's going to do. There's many stories of older ladies who somehow have just carried the torch of lucha libre into their later years and are fixtures at these arenas. And and so that's very beautiful. I mean, you go to the wrestling event to experience certainly the matches, but you experience community, you experience the other personalities that you find present there.
Yeah. So do you think then
That's one of my
with
favorite parts
yeah,
in the documentary. And if I can find it, I'll send you a clip. So if you want to insert it, but
oh, cool.
is that audience participation segment because it really is when it's invariable. It's always going to happen in a match. Uh, is the wrestlers wrestling among the fans? And so someone will get thrown out of the ring, and the other wrestler will chase them out into the ring, and they will wrestle among the crowd. They'll take somebody's folding chair, and they'll use it as a weapon. And those moments are just so exhilarating and so so um, it's slightly managed chaos, and you just look forward to that happening. And so that audience participation segment in the documentary, it really captures a little bit of that.
No, it does. It really does. The other bit I really liked about, and we touched on it earlier, but Mascarita Sagrada. You know, you
Yeah.
go through. I won't say it all on here because I want people to watch it. I don't want to give it all away. But you go through like his life and his representation in lucha libre and wrestling. What is it about that then? You know, because it's a very empowering segment, and in as someone who's seen mini wrestlers. I always trip over what term to use now. The mini wrestlers in different,
Yeah.
organisations around the world and in the UK, and a lot of the time they are used in a kind of jokey, kind of exploitive kind of way. You know, Lucha Libre, they are there to wrestle. They do wrestle. You know, they've got the skills to do it, and you kind
Yeah.
of cover that in the documentary. You know, what was it about that just sort of drew you in really because you talk about his life story like that. What was it that made you kind of focus in on that? Was it something you were you trying to shape like maybe different representation of it, or what was it
Yeah.
that drew you to it?
Yeah. In the case of Mascarita, I had seen him wrestle in Los Angeles,
Mhm.
and I thought it would be an interesting conversation to sit with him and see what his background was, what led him to take on this profession. And he had a very beautiful story. It was very much a part of, his journey was, becoming interested in martial arts. He's, um, at least on the surface, you don't think that he has the physique to be an athlete on that level, but he loved martial arts, so he pursued it. Somebody saw him in the gym and encouraged him to pursue lucha libre. Um, and he fell in with a group of the previous generation of wrestlers who were little people who were also wrestling. And he just had a blast. He got his ass kicked at that first match, and yet um, he did well enough. He told me, he said, in that first match he didn't know anything about lucha libre. They just needed a guy. They were short one wrestler, and so they put him in the ring, and he faked his way through it. But the camaraderie that he felt with other little people was the thing that kept him going. And certainly then he learned to develop his skills, became a very wonderful wrestler on top of it. And so his story, that notion of empowerment, where what was his future going to be, as a little person, in Mexico, which is at least at the time, I don't know if his situation would be considered a disability or not, but it's certainly he did the cards were certainly stacked a little bit against him. And so when he found a profession that could give him a livelihood, I mean, he has a family, he's got a beautiful house. The the lucha libre profession has given him a beautiful future. It gave him an opportunity um, to have a life that I don't think he would have dreamed of had he continued, in some other path.
Yeah,
So I think he's very respectful of the profession. He has had his business complications because of the use of the name Mascarita Sagrada. But now he's got another gimmick that he's been wrestling with. He's probably in his early 60s at this point, and he continues to wrestle.
I get that. Yeah,
And so I'll send you his info. I don't know if you can put it up there, but he's a wonderful, wonderful person, a wonderful wrestler. And I think it was just trying to honor his journey and to tell his story in a human way with some nuance, with some depth, to sort of transcend that, for lack of a better word, circus freak
yeah.
notion that I think people have of little people who wrestle.
No,
And
no,
it was funny.
oh, go on.
It was funny because I did struggle with it, a little bit, and I reached out to the Little People's Association of the United States of America, And I go, look, yeah, what do you think? I want to tell this story. Do you feel like it would be exploitative? And they said, well, what does he think about it? And I went with that. And he was, he wanted to be involved. He wanted to tell this story. And so that was my guide. Those were my marching orders, is whatever he was comfortable with. I was willing to take it, as far as I could, and to tell that story, to try to tell a little mini history of little people in Lucha Libre.
No, you do. It's a great segment, and again, it's one of those. Dare I say it? Sometimes that's one of the sort of sides of it that gets overlooked sometimes because
Yeah.
people. I mean, there's a lot of other things to look at, but it is the Lucha Libre. What is it that makes it so inclusive then? Because again, you've got all the different characters. They've always promoted the female wrestlers just as much as the men. In the last, well, from what I remember anyway, only maybe not historically, but no, nowadays they do. You've also got the exoticas. You've got the little people. What is it that makes it such an inclusive environment?
Well, there's all those traditions that are operative, right? There's the exotico tradition has been a part of lucha libre from the beginning, that's so there's an acceptance, there's always going to be a reintroduction of the character. When I was shooting the film, there was just a brilliant exotico, Maximo, and I believe he was part of the Brazos family, the Brazo de Oro, Brazo de Plata. Um, and so, I mean, man, he was, certainly he fulfilled the role of being an exotico, but he was a brilliant wrestler as well. I mean, I just saw him do things in the ring that were just incredible. Um, so it's not just the gimmick, right? It's their abilities, and I think people respond to that, and people are smart enough to observe that, these people have earned their place to be in the ring. With the women wrestlers, the one wrestler that I was very aware of was Uvia, and she was the daughter of a luchador. And so she was an amazing wrestler. There's many examples of women of luchadoras that are just really excellent at their job. So you're not going to last if you don't have anything more than just a gimmick. And I think I've seen that over and over again. There's someone will be in there, and but it's a momentary sort of fascination that the audience has. I think ultimately people want to see that you have some wrestling chops, some abilities, and so be it a woman, be it an exotico, be it a little person, be it a man wrestling with a mask, unless you have the wrestling um, skills, you're not gonna have a long career.
Definitely. And what do you think then? Like with Lucha Libre, it's kept its identity and it's grown. I mean, the UK wrestling scene, whilst the British wrestling style is still around, it's largely become sort of an American style, and even like
Yeah.
the Japanese style now. I mean, there is a strong style, but again, it's is nowadays when you watch shows, Japan and sort of American indie shows, kind of dare I say, I'll probably get a lot of slack for this, look a little bit interchangeable. But
Yeah.
Lucha Libre has always kept its style. Yeah, it incorporates other pieces, but it's never lost its core identity. Whereas I think other styles have started to do that over the last sort of 20 or 30 years and sort of dilute into I guess, the WWE style or whatever it is. Why is Lucha Libre kind of kept that out? Why is it sort of, or it's absorbed it on its own terms? What is it about Lucha Libre that's made it such a strong style that it stays where it is?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that that's completely accurate because I do, certainly my experience of some of the events, are, at least in terms of the presentation, right? There are the stylings of WWE, there is a grandness to it. the video screens, the rock music, the all those trappings that make a spectacle have been embraced.
Yeah.
Um, there are some versions of, it's I don't know if mixed martial arts
Mm.
is the correct term, but I've seen some of those stylings incorporated into
Yeah.
lucha libre where it's more extreme violent. And I mean, the thing about lucha libre, at least traditionally, is that, the holds were very important. And then with more recent generations of luchadores, there's that high flying acrobatic aspect to it. Uh, Very dangerous. The guys get hurt, but the fans love it. I love it, and I feel guilty for loving it. But they take so many risks,
Yeah.
in trying to really outdo each other in terms of, you know, um, expressing the spectacle aspect of it through their maneuvers. So I think there has been some integration of American styles of those types of, trappings, but you can always find some of the classic wrestling traditions. I talk about Solar in the documentary, and he's really big about preserving that classic hold maneuver type style of wrestling that El Santo was famous for. He does it. His matches are less competitive and more like exhibitions. And so I think he's trying to preserve that. But he's an older generation of wrestler. I do hope that there's others that are keeping that on because it is very impressive. It's just a slower pace, and I don't know if current audiences have the same fascination that audiences of another era might have.
Yeah.
But he's trying to keep it alive. I think they both inform each other, American style and lucha libre. I think there's a little bit of a embrace of both, just because I think they have to compete with the American WWE traditions. I know that WWE has done shows in Mexico, so they have to compete. So there is an embrace of the traditions, other traditions.
And my last main question really is like Lucha Libre. This documentary, as I say, is 15 years old next year. It To me, it captured a real main point as Lucha Libre was expanding. As we talk today now, I mean, in the UK, there's a Lucha Britannia organisation that
Oh,
promotes.
wow.
That's it's kind of over there. I'll send you a link for them.
Yeah.
Also, WWE now have AAA. They bought that and are running that still through Mexico and everything like that. But they're bringing more eyes on that now. It's a weekly show now. You can see it, or in the UK, you can see it on the WWE's YouTube channel. I think in America, it's on one of your channel. I forget now, but
Yeah.
we get it for free on YouTube, so I'm happy with that. And look, CMML is still going, the oldest promotion in the world, and there's lucha stars appearing in all different organizations around the world now. What is it even now? Now after all this, Lucha Libre is still growing. It's still expanding. There still seems to be more for it to do. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you feel about that? 'Cause obviously you've captured this very important moment in time in your documentary, and since then it's growing and growing even more. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you feel about sort of lucha libre and that growth since from what you've done since that point?
I love it. I mean, you can't help but, be excited to see it perpetuate itself and to grow. Um, there's one of the things that I try to express in the documentary is this notion that it's a profession. And so for me to see that it continues to grow and to expand, that means that there's opportunities for younger wrestlers where they can take this thing that they might have fallen in love with when they were kids and to have venues in which they can uh, uh, do their profession, that they can have work opportunities. So it's exciting, at least on that level, having gotten to know some of these wrestlers. You want them to have opportunities. And then just as a cultural experience, you want to make sure that Lucha Libre continues. I do wish, that the film and television aspect of it would catch up with what WWE is doing. Because I'd love to see more of the luchador image expressed in, uh, an action film or some type of thriller
Mm.
film. That would be exciting to be able to establish um, the luchador image, not just in the comedic realm, which is what Nacho Libre did, but, as this cool, exciting, dynamic, charismatic figure. I would love to see that. I would love to see that take off. And I don't think that that's been achieved yet. I know that Robert Rodriguez had his what was it? He had
Oh,
his
Lucha Underground.
Lucha
Lucha
Underground. Yeah,
Underground. Yeah.
yeah. And there were some great characters that came out of that.
Mm.
But that was a little bit more niche. And so for me, in mainstream American culture, I would love for Lucha Libre to put, its flag down and be that, and have that be in a movie, in a theatrical film, or, some big sensation on streaming. That would be very exciting to me. That would be a big step forward. And I look forward to that day when that happens.
Excellent. And my other question, my last question. I keep coming up with more there as we go. Um, 15 years next year since it came out. Any chance of a director's cut?
Like I said, when we were talking off camera, you know, uh, you do something, and what I would love to do, and I haven't made any effort in this regard, is that I would love to do Tales of Masked Women. Because I think
Okay.
that would be the next story to tell, because there's so many uh, Mexican women who wear the mask and wrestle. Um, there's been a handful that have been able to sustain a career for a long period of time, but yeah, that's a tough road. That's tougher than being a luchador, is being a woman and being a wrestler and to wear a mask. That's a hard thing to take on. And so I think there's some great stories in that. If I were to do something, I think that would be the one.
No,
If
cool.
not a narrative film with a luchador character.
Nice. That'd be cool. So, what else are you up to nowadays? Then, 'cause obviously, we know you from the documentary. What else
Yeah.
is going on? What else have you been doing?
I love that you took interest in the documentary, because it's a little bit of an anomaly for me, because I'm a narrative filmmaker. I've directed for television. I've directed a lot of smaller independent projects. I directed a feature film, a boxing movie. So I do have that interest in combat and pugilism and all that. But I'm actually I have a project called Last Band Standing, which is a music project, and it's a 1964 San Antonio, Texas. There was a big rhythm and blues scene, and so I've written a story which is an ensemble story, coming of age story about young musicians in that world. And so that's the project that I've committed a lot of energy into trying to get off the ground. So, we'll see. The dream is to be able to shoot it next year. I'm working with an excellent producer, and so we're trying to put together the money for it. But that's the next thing on my agenda right now.
Excellent. That sounds really good. I look forward to that. I like a bit of that music
Yeah.
myself. So,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, I'll keep my eye out for that. Now, if anyone watching this is interested in sort of getting in touch with you or contacting you or whatever, what's the best way for them to do that?
So I have a website, carlosaviladirector.com. and you can reach me through there. There's if you want to send me an email or a
I'll put
message,
it in there.
you can do there.
I'll link
Yeah,
it in the show
you can
notes
reach
for
me
you.
that way. You can reach me that way. And then we had talked about the availability of Tales of Mask Man. You found your own way of seeing it, but it is available on eBay and on Amazon. And I'm sure it's out there on some of those renegade sites. Um, my the thing that brought me a great deal of perverse joy was if you go to Lucha Libre events in Mexico City, you always see the vendors, right? And there's some that specialize in DVDs and Blu-rays. And I have been told by numerous people that Tales of Masked Man is available in a bootleg copy uh, at some of these big wrestling events. So I've been bootlegged by the finest people in Mexico. So it is available. So if you find yourself in Mexico City, look for it at the video wrestling specialty vendor outside of Arena Mexico or Arena Coliseo.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for taking the
Absolutely.
time today to join us.
Absolutely.
I've got a million more questions, but we could
Yeah.
do like about a 10-hour podcast on this. But I'll let you go and
Fantastic.
get on with your day now. No, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Brett. Thanks for your interest and the audience. Thanks for listening.
Thank you once again to Carlos for taking the time to join us this week and discuss his awesome documentary. You do need to check that out. All the details are on our show notes. You can find out about Carlos on there and some of the stars of the documentary as well, and how to follow them and see what they're up to. It's highly, highly recommended and well worth your time. So again, these will all be on our show notes on the grappleofyoureye.com, which is our mothership. Whilst there, you can check out all our past episodes and all the different things we've got going on, all our social media links. You've got Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and all those. And remember, our new episodes drop every Thursday at 7 a.m. UK time. You can watch them on YouTube. Please go there, subscribe now, enable notifications. It really does make a difference. Join in, leave some comments. And also, you can listen to our podcasts on all the major podcast apps. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, and all the different podcast places that you can find podcasts. You will find us. This brings this week's episode to a close now. I've been your host, Brett Summers. We will be back again next week with another guest. So in the meantime, stay safe and stay on the mats.